Let's begin. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Parth Shukla, and I manage the Code for GovTech initiative at Samagra. I'll be taking the moderation and narration of this segment of the day for you. We are ready to now begin with the first panel in this hall. This is under the theme of building DPGs. The first panel is called Unlocking the Potential of Open Source. Open source has long sustained products over decades, but have we utilized the full potential when it comes to tech for impact? So to discuss more on this, I would like to invite Mr. Venkatesh Hariharan, who would be the moderator of the panel. Mr. Venkatesh is the India representative for Open Innovations Network, and he's celebrated open source champion in the country and the tech policy space in particular. He's also public policy advisor at Force United and has served as head of public policy and government affairs with Google, corporate affairs director at Red Hat, and so on. Welcome, Venkatesh. We are excited for you to moderate this panel. Over to you.
Thank you. I'll invite Akhila, Pradipta, and Adi to come on stage. Thank you, everybody. Very quickly, I'll introduce the panelists. Akhila is one of the co-founders of Tech for Good community, a non-profit which builds software for other non-profits. They are based in Bangalore. Pradipta is the product strategy lead at the Center of Excellence in Human-Centered Computing at IIIT Delhi. And she has also built 2 or 3 DPGs herself. So she brings in both an open source and a digital public good expertise. Aditeshwar Seth is a professor at IIT Delhi, and he is also the founder of Gramvani. So very quickly, we will spend about 40-45 minutes exploring the issue of unlocking the power of open source. My name is Venkatesh Hariharan. I used to head policy for Red Hat. So I've been observing the open source community since the year 2000. And one of the things that really strikes me is that when we started evangelizing open source in India, we were literally fighting with our backs to the wall. Everybody used to say, why should we not use open source will not work. It's a community of volunteers. Proprietary software was the norm at that point in time, and open source was the exception. But cut to 2025, proprietary software is the exception and open source is the norm. If you look at pretty much the technology architecture of any organization today, 80 to 90% of it is open source. Even large banks which are heavily dependent on proprietary technologies, they are now trying to, hollowing out the core, as they call it, and moving out of proprietary infrastructure into open source. So the other issue that has happened is that the government has a number of policies around open source. We heard R.S. Sharma say that we have an open API policy, we have an open source policy. When he was IT secretary, he also created a policy on collaborative development of open source applications. And that led to the creation of the OpenForge platform, where almost about 4,000 government software are archived. It's a library of sort that other government departments can use. In terms of usage of open source, India has done extremely well. If you look at all the major nation scale projects that have been deployed, whether it's Aadhaar, UPI, GST, all of them are heavily using open source. But you could say that in some areas there is a lot that we can do in terms of unlocking open source. For example, if you look at OpenForge, there are 4,000 projects, but none of those projects have an open source community. So is there something that can be done? If you look at go to Hugging Face, etc. today, the leading open source software is coming either from the US or from China. There are very few examples of Indians creating open source projects that are globally relevant. Pradipta has worked on one of the rare examples, so we will ask her more about that. So the other dimension of unlocking the power of open source is the developer capabilities. And if you go to GitHub today, India's today is the second largest community on GitHub. I think almost about 8 million developers. It's expected that in the next few years, we will overtake US and become the largest country represented on GitHub. So there are multiple dimensions when it comes to unlocking the power of open source. But let me start with Akila. In the entire process of building the software that you are building for other nonprofits, you arrived at it through a process of elimination. You worked with a number of proprietary organizations, tried to scale it, it didn't work. So can you just walk us through that process? And also on a slightly philosophical note, the process of elimination you went through reminds me of the process that Buddha went through. He said that this neti, so not this, and then he arrived at the legendary nirvana. So your open source nirvana journey.
I never thought that would be a question, open source nirvana, but nicely put. All right, so we started to work in the tech for impact space in 2018. Small organization, just 3 co-founders got together saying, let's do something. And it's not building technology, but making technology more accessible. And till today, that remains the same goal. But the way we do it has evolved over a period of time. Right? So this whole journey that has gotten us to this point where we've been able to build large-scale open source infrastructure for nonprofits to use has been nothing but a journey of pilots and pivots and pilots. So the way it started was that the first ever reason why we pivoted, it felt like the scene in Friends. Have you guys watched the series? Where Ross says pivot, and pushes this entire suitcase up a stairwell. That's how it felt like, pushing technology that didn't work for nonprofits up a stairwell that wasn't even meant for it. So when we started building, or when we started our entire work, the journey, the goal was to build capacity in organizations to use technology better. Right? Because we know that the social impact space has the scarcity of resources. I mean both manpower as well as monetary resources. Because of this, that they don't have tech resources within their orgs, and how do we sort of make technology more accessible to them? Maybe build capacity. That was like pilot 1. Then when we started doing that, we said there are so many free licenses out there. Back in the day where we said, okay, there are free licenses, let's use the free licenses. One such example is Salesforce, that we said, okay, there are 10 free licenses for Salesforce, and why don't we sort of help organizations apply for these licenses and get it for a lifetime of free licenses. Now here's where the catch is, right? We realized upon working with Salesforce that there were 4 people globally who would approve the nonprofit NPSP pack for all of the organizations across the globe. And which meant that organizations that applied to the free licenses were backed by 3 years. So people wouldn't get licenses at all because it was so backed. Of course, they had limited resources, etc. And the second thing we realized was that the tools that were already there, the proprietary tools that exist, were not really built for non-profit use cases because our workflows are also different. So we'd force fit a process into a product. Did not make sense. Very restrictive. So then we started sort of moving away, of course, the cost aspect of it, the vendor lock-ins, every single thing about proprietary software it became like a huge bottleneck. We didn't realize along the way. And it took us 4 years to get there because we'd say, okay, there's free software, we build capacity, why don't you use it? Today we work with about 2,500 organizations. But the learning has been such that something that was tried in terms of tech never sat, it never fit. So we had to keep changing. So that's where the first or second pivot that we did, we started deploying our own open source systems that were available, anything that made sense to nonprofits, but followed the 80-20 principle. Now, the 80-20 principle is saying that, okay, let's standardize workflows to organizations to an 80%. We don't have to give you 100% fully custom software because nobody's going to use it, we know that. Let's use it to a point where we say, okay, we've used it for enough time to know what else we want to add. The journey doesn't build with the code or the idea of what we want, but along the way of using a software is when we realize what is the ultimate process we want to achieve. The the degrees of freedom that you get in terms of, like I always say, the degrees of freedom that you get with open source, it's not just about code, it's not just about community. It's about cognitive freedom to be able to think what you want and say, okay, is this possible? Is that a possibility? Open possibilities. That's the whole, I think beyond tech, for me, that's what stands out. And a lot of the times when we've used, or proprietary tools that we've used, we've not had this cognitive freedom, no access to it because the tech source code is closed. Now, and this sort of also leads to us creating technical debts, creative debts, and using suboptimal, software to be able to run our operations. So yeah, so overall degrees of freedom when we say code, community, and I would also say cognitive thinking and creativity, that sort of pivots. So yeah, we deployed these open source systems for organizations individually. We'd pick up like each problem statement for data management and various things, and then sort of deploy it. And we realized that it's not a success. Let's say that it's not a success. 33 systems were built and deployed in 8 months. Speed achievable because it's open source. We pulled in like various repos that was already there. But again, why didn't it stick? So that was again a capacity issue again. So it's like a dog-eat-dog problem, So there is no capacity, then there's a software. There is software, then there is no capacity. So it sort of became a thing where we would build tech, then build capacity. Build tech, then build capacity. So that's been the pivot and pilot journey for us so far, but not sure how successful.
So it's good that you mentioned the capacity bit, because one of the things that we wanted to do when we were at Red Hat is also see Red Hat become popular on the desktop. So there was a team of us that really wanted to push that, but I think one of the and then there was a whole group of us who localized Linux to Indian languages, but I think one of the things we forgot to do was to build in the support and we built the technology but not the ground infrastructure. So if something went wrong, then who would support it? I think that's where we had to look at building that ecosystem. We'll come to that maybe later, but again, one of the, so we can say that we have about 8 million people on GitHub, but I think are we just consuming open source software? Are we actually contributing back to the global commons? If you look at an open source maturity model, I think there are 3 steps to it. One is where you consume it, and I think we are fantastic at that. Without credit sometimes. The next level is where we contribute back to the global commons, and the third level is where we are actually creating our own open source projects which are becoming globally relevant. And that's where Pradipta, you've done some work. Bamni has gone to about 50 countries. You also worked on other digital public goods which have been used in Africa and other. So can you tell us a little bit about how taking off from the Bamni experience, how can India build globally relevant digital public goods, open source technologies?
Yeah. So I'll talk a little bit about my journey. So I was lucky to be within ThoughtWorks. It's a global consultancy at that time when the leadership decided, hey, we are going to create a team for social impact. And again, we also went through pivots. Our first iteration of tech for good was that, hey, we are going to contribute to existing open source, globally, used, widely adopted open source tech. And we'll provide our expertise, which is again around technology, architecture, design, etc. And what we did that for about 2 or 3 years. We, ODK, we contributed to OpenMRS, which are, all these public goods. What we realized was, we were so far away from the problem. And we didn't know whether what we were doing was actually impacting somebody on the ground. So then we said, okay, we are going to pivot. And we were very lucky for the leadership to give us the resources. We actually went and met a lot of grassroots NGOs in India. We did like like a road trip of sorts. And we came across these group of doctors who were doing fantastic work in rural Chhattisgarh. And they were trying to build their own technology with, and they were, struggling with it. So when we went there, they said, can you come and help us? So Bamni was not born as an open source product, but it started off as that, hey, can we help these group of doctors, digitize their hospital work and make it easier, because they were very, very low resourced. Like, there's a wait period for patients for about 6 days to go and actually be able to see a doctor there. So that's how, low resource they were. So Bamni started off as this one project for this particular hospital, and soon we realized that, hey, there are other such, entities, NGOs who are working in the grassroots, who are, are very, need the similar kind of thing, and that's how it pivoted from being just a one-off solution, custom, to being a product. Now today Bamni is adopted cut to 25. It's adopted in about 50 countries, 500 plus sites, and I'm very happy and proud to say that there was no marketing involved, right? It was zero marketing. It was all adoption because people saw value in whatever was done. Now, one of the things I feel that helped is that we didn't build it in a proprietary way. We solved a problem which we saw other proprietary open or even open source other platforms that had not solved it till yet. And we stayed connected with those communities. Not always us being part of those communities were seen in a very positive light. Hey, why is a private company doing this work? Was something we had to go and explain and say, hey, we are doing this because we are supported by the leadership. That was as basic as that. But we did had to go through that journey of saying we are in it for the right reasons. But the fact that we were already plugged into communities of practitioners, communities of adopters, I think that was a main reason. So being connected to a community or thinking of a community from the very beginning, I think helped Bamni to be where it is today. There's another story, right? In eGov Foundation, we built another DPG for health. There, the journey was very different, right? It was funded, again, very well funded. But there, what we were pitching to, again, open source, because, the ethos has been always open source. But there we were pitching to national governments, right? And there the ask from the governments has always been that, are you people coming from India becoming a big tech for, for Africa, right? So there it was about, we want to make sure we have the capacity to continue, or like you help build our capacity, which was our sort of, again, our ethos, because we were not coming from a proprietary lens. We wanted people to adopt it and make it their own. So a significant part, at least about 50% of our effort, was not just building the technology, but in ensuring that, the teams are trained, they are, they adopt it or they make it their own, which means that the journey is slower.
Yeah.
It's not as fast. But that journey is what ultimately ensures that, there is ownership. So working with the people who are going to adopt the software, making sure that there is a sense of ownership from them to the point of co-creating with them, right? Uh, and it was very stressful for our team, like they don't understand technology, but that painful journey means that, there is that they say this is what we have built, right? So I think there are still unsolved problems. I think what we see in open source are still that while adoption can be driven by communities, innovation, new ideas can come from communities, but sustaining the core product, uh, I think I've been in open source for about 10, 14 years now. I have not yet come across a very good model where the core product can be sustained financially through the community of community effort. I mean, Linux is a case, and we all look up to Linux. But I don't know in the DPG space, which is for where it's about not for the businesses, but for governments or for NGOs. I mean, I haven't come across sustainability being achieved
I
yet.
think I have spoken to a number of DPGs. I think that is definitely a challenge. How do you sustain the maybe what you're doing with the subscription model might be an alternative path forward.
It's not a proven model. Subscriptions also are not. We haven't had enough example, or the sector hasn't had enough experience in this space of adopting open source tools at scale yet for us to say what would be successful. I think that also is very experimental. Monetary experiments that you conduct on experimental open source.
I hope you have 100,000 nonprofits, subscribing to your software so that, there is a proven model of alternative, development of DPGs, which is not dependent only on the funders. I think from all the conversations I've had with DPG creators, the sustainability of the digital public good is something that, all of them are struggling with. Even if they are well funded, they have, really robust funders backing them. Maybe a membership model, maybe, where countries that are benefiting from the digital public good contribute something back to it. We are already seeing some small green shoots, for example, with the MOSIP, which is the Modular Open Source Identity Project, which is the equivalent of Aadhaar, an open source implementation of Aadhaar. Countries like Ethiopia, etc., are contributing code back to the main, main code base. Adi, let me come to you. You are the co-founder of Gramvani, which is a social tech organization incubated at IIT Delhi. And one of the things that really intrigued me when I read through the Mobile Vani ethos, the manifesto, is that the ethos seems to resonate very strongly with open source, because you talk about equitable access, you talk about shared understanding, you talk about the ability to facilitate action. So tell us a little bit about Gramvani, and why did you choose to build it on open source?
So Gramvani is basically providing a communication infrastructure for rural communities to share information with one another, and with the goal that sharing of knowledge will help people learn from one another. It will improve local governance, because when people call into these systems and they talk about problems that they're facing, day-to-day civic issues or access to government schemes and entitlements, and it's all going on a public forum, then media, just like how media plays a role in democracy of holding different stakeholders accountable, right? So that's what Gramvani does in the rural space. Why did we build everything on open source? Well, because nobody has any money to buy. So that's of course there. We've also ended up contributing back into many of these different platforms. But also, just wanted to resonate all the whatever has been said, right? That being in touch with the community is very important when you're trying to think of or building a product. So all the needs really need to emerge from the community, because otherwise, if you are thinking from the mindset of the government or from the market, then you end up with a very different conceptualization of what the problem is. But when you go into the field and you talk to the community, right, then you start hearing issues on water security, issues on access to Narega, wages getting delayed, issues with PDS access, and then you start thinking very differently that if that is the problem, then what sort of systems are needed to solve it? And then you suddenly find that whatever exists is not really geared for the job, right? So that's one of the aspects. Another aspect to touch upon when it comes to like taking some of these products global, I think it is, so there's two parts probably to it. One is that the product itself should be designed in a way that it can be contextualized to different settings. Yeah. Because otherwise, if you build one system to solve one problem, then it's just going to work for that purpose, right? But this is where the whole DPG thinking becomes very useful, right? That if you start thinking of it in terms of building blocks that different people can kind of compose together, or even if not in a fully DPG, I mean, that kind of a manner, but as long as this context, people can pick and choose and they can configure it, right? So that becomes very useful. The challenge over there, of course, is that the product design itself has to keep that in mind from the very beginning, right? So instead of hard coding, right, you design the software itself that it's open and it can be picked up and so on. The second aspect with going global also, however, is that people can take the product and use it wherever, right? So Gramani's products also have been used in many countries, and there's two products that we've done. Both have had very good uptake. But with both products, we didn't invest a lot in actually building an open source community around it. Yeah. That is something we haven't learned, and great to see Aragya over here from Fast United, and right. So we've now, with some of the new work that we're doing, we're trying to learn from successful open source projects. How do we build an open source community around it? Yeah. Because the software has to be written in that way. That right. I mean, documentation is just one part of it, but the whole design has to keep that in mind, that maybe in India we're using village boundaries for something. In some other country, right, they don't call it a village, they call it something else, and maybe those boundaries might, right, I mean, it needs to be completely configurable, right, and instead of being hard-coded. So those are some important aspects that I think in India, building open source communities is something that we need to learn how to do. I don't think that we know how to build products, we know how to understand the problem, build products to solve the problem. And as long as it's done well, you can take it global. But I think building that open source community is where some of the key gaps are right now. Yeah.
I agree. Actually, there were Karan, who was supposed to be here. He and I did a workshop for eGov, and about 40 of the eGov folks attended that workshop. And the entire effort was to see how we can get eGov to become more open source friendly. I think that's a work in progress, but within eGov there is also Bodhish, who's running the pupil first, the 10-bed ICU software. And during COVID times, they started that project, and they completely built in the open. So it was a very different kind of a model of software development compared to a lot of the DPGs where, one of the big software services company builds the software, and then you put an open source license on it, but there is no continuity in terms of building an open source community around it. So one of the recommendations that we have made to some of these organizations is that you have to add a line item for a community manager, because without that you do not build a community. You can't just throw the software, slap an open source license, and it doesn't become open source unless it has a community around it. Yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to say this, that it's very hard to build a community later on.
Yes. Yes.
I will go very fast, yes, and I will develop this, and at some point I will build the community. I think if you're not you don't start at the very beginning, because yes, community participation, community involvement, supporting the community is a lot of hard work.
Yes.
It's not something that I do on a weekend, or it is a project by itself, and it also will slow you down, sort of in a way that, hey, I'm a developer, why do I have to teach another guy who's asking me stupid questions from halfway across the world? But I think if you don't build that culture up front, that means you're going to go maybe at half the speed that you have gone. It's very
But
difficult to
Pradipta,
later on say, I will slap this on top somehow.
Yeah, so I think that's a good point. It's a conscious choice. And it reminds me of that old African saying, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, take others along with you. And, the challenges for the developer, in taking that either the proprietary path or the open source path is, for example, one of the developers that I spoke to, she told me that it's very different. I have a team of people. If I ask them to do this, they are at my beck and call. But, if I am building an open source community, I am at their beck and call. So she built this team of volunteers, and some of them were, working till 8 o'clock, and then after 8 o'clock they became free, and they would, then come on the calls. So she had to start completely rejigging it. And it's not that, you do that call at 8 o'clock and by 10 o'clock the code is there. It may come maybe a week later when, the next Sunday or something like that. So the way you have to re-architect your processes when you want to build an open source community, I wish, Bodhish could have been here because his flight got cancelled, but he's done a brilliant job in building the 10-bed ICU software. I think they have almost about, last time I spoke to him, last week when I spoke to him, he said that we have about 1,200 volunteers for building the software, which is really amazing. I think those are the kind of examples. One point. The other thing is that many of the people who are funding the digital public goods, they say, we are okay with it being open source, but I think one of the things we need to go a step beyond that, and not just putting an open source license on it, but actively investing in creating a community around that digital public good.
Oh, funding. Yeah. Lovely topic. Lovely topic. Okay. This is, okay. So I think the problem here becomes like, say, builders like Tech for Good community, like Avni, like so many of us, right? We're all heavily capital dependent on the funding ecosystem that sort of has to give us the initial pump to be able to build something to show a proof of concept, and then consumptions happen of the software. Consumption that is correlated to contribution. Now, the reason why I've also closely studied Bodhish's success story, and what I think was also the fact that Bodhish had like so many contributions, maintainers, etc., which is amazing. Also because the consumption of that software started happening with at government levels. So the rate at which, the scale at which a consumption of a software happened started creating that pull for the developer community as well. The same goes for funding as well. But there are certain projects that I think, if we build, the softwares that we're building today cannot sustain without funding ecosystem support. And funding ecosystem support will also, it's also withdrawn because there's a certain period, like say 1 to 3 years, I will make a commitment of you building this. After 3 years, they would like to fund some other project. But what happens to this? This is how we contribute to the internet's graveyard of software that already exists. Right? So we're just adding to that because we don't have enough funding. And why can't we sustain what we build is because the users that we're serving do not have budgets to sort of help us sustain it as well. Same thing, because there's no sustenance, there's no contribution or interest from the developer community. So it is just, it is a very, it's such an interconnected problem. Funding is not the only reason. Consumption doesn't happen because awareness capacity doesn't exist. The whole trust layer that has to come with open source, that is still a struggle that we all face. at the grassroots level, where we're still trying to say open source doesn't mean open all your data. So that's the level at which we are saying that, okay, what does it mean? And even to funders, in fact, that they also have had a similar problem. Like when we used to do help organization get tech budgets, that's something that we did as well, because you have to have a tech budget to be able to make that investment. Now, you go to a funder, and then we're doing like advocacy with them saying, hey, organizations require like 1-2% of funding like for their technical budgets, etc. And maybe there will be a certain priority that can be set, and the funder can help them with that, and then provide money to be able to invest in that. But now there is lack of capacity in the funding ecosystem to say how much money they will give to a non-profit or to like a consumer. Now, that money that they give sometimes becomes that the non-profit has completely burnt through that cash, saying that, okay, the funder has given me 50 lakhs to build my new platform, and everybody wants a platform and an app. That's a story for another time. But the second you say that, okay, that, you know, I give you 50 lakhs to build, this is a real-time story, right? This organization came to us saying that, hey, we got money from our funder to build X platform. It was in EdTech. And then told us that, hey, can you help us figure out where to go? And we have 1 year to spend this money. That's not the way we look at building software, isn't it? It cannot be built that way. Now, this, because we declined the request, because the entire process wasn't thought through. A workflow wasn't defined. You can't achieve X amount of impact but with just technology. That is an absolute myth, right? Like, even though we build software, I keep saying this, technology is not going to solve for everything at all. Now, this organization goes to a local vendor who has taken 50 lakhs from them, built the software. The non-profit wanted to make one field change. They started taking money to make small changes. The non-profit had too many changes that they wanted, through which the entire vendor, the vendor that was working with them, kept like, you know, making those changes and changes and changes. It's been 4 years, guys, they're still changing, right? So, and the amount of money that has gone into changing an icon from left to right, okay, that is resistance to change on using software. That's another problem, right? But we're saying that we're burning through cash and budgets that was even given to us because of the lack of awareness, and because of which adoption of open source itself becomes like really low. And yeah, many organizations that, the ones that is the 50 lakh one that I told you about, the other one invested 14 lakhs in an MIS software, which is proprietary again. They pay license fees every year. And they wanted to withdraw, and they wanted to have some data insights that they wanted to get from their MIS platform. The vendor refused to share. So the data lies with them. It's a complete lock-in. They do not have proof of their impact for the last 6 months because they've had a conflict with the vendor. Now, these are technical debts that you're incurring with the limited funding that you're getting. And the funders have also lost faith that, okay, we give nonprofits a tech budget, they burn through. So then this is like we need more champion stories to say it's not happening. And now I think Bodhish being an example is a great sort of champion story for all of us.
I just want to make one point. I mean, yeah, you know, have seen a lot of these, the same thing. Just one point though is that what I have seen and what I have learnt is that still most open source software today, except maybe for Linux, I mean, and even with Linux, it was, you know, Linus, you know, doing the majority of the work for at least a decade before, you know, it got such widely adopted and companies started investing and putting developers to work on it. Still 98-99% of the code, the core stuff is still written by people who are paid to do the work. So I don't know if that has changed even today. I don't know Bodhish's story. If he's been able to crack that problem, that's great. But for every other software, I mean, open source communities help in adoption. You know, without that, you can't get adoption, you know. They help in innovation, in ideas from the field, you know, keeping you connected to the people who you're building the stuff really for, but the core still has to be paid staff. That's what I've seen.
Adi, you want to add to that?
Actually, something Akila mentioned, right? Contribution being correlated with consumption. I think a lot of the open source contributions come from people who are using the software or something themselves, right? So there is a bit of a paradox over here, right? Because if the software is being used by companies, and that's where engineers, developers working in those companies will end up contributing. I mean, that's one thing we've seen so much in like Google and Facebook. I mean, there's some other problems kind of with that, but I mean, we do see a lot of great contributions coming in from that side. But if the software is built for, let's say, NGOs who are using it, but they don't have that kind of a developer expertise themselves to contribute, right? Then it won't sort of work, right? So I mean, grants are useful, and beyond that, I mean, basically, let's figure out, right, more innovative ways of doing it. But yeah, I mean, we need to do it because otherwise it won't get built. So
the conundrum of how do you fund these open source projects, I think that's something that's a work in progress. The other issue is that I think when it again going back to this whole creation of open source software, I think I feel that we are kind of at the cusp of a point in time where India is about to start really building global open source projects. I think MOSIP is one of the examples. It's now being rolled out almost about 19 different countries. I think about 100 million IDs have been issued through MOSIP. It's of course a classical digital public goods. Because Aadhaar could not be rolled out to other countries, the Aadhaar team helped in the creation of MOSIP. We have been pushing for UPI to be open sourced without much success, I think. But if that happens, then I think that would also be a great case study. My guess is that the Brazilians might beat us to it because they built something called PIX, which is again equivalent of UPI. And they have a very strong open source community. But I think we're still, I think we're kind of at a cusp where we can see major open source projects emerge out of India. Organizations like FOSS United, of course, are supporting, giving grants, etc., to make that happen. But I realize that we are running short of time. So if there are any questions, we can take a few quick questions. He raised his hand first, so I'll give the mic.
Hi Akila. Hi everyone. I want to ask you, I mean, I've been wondering about this myself. I have recently co-founded an NGO which is doing AI healthcare open source projects. We were incubated at People Plus AI. And when you're a newly registered NGO, you can't get CSR funding for like 3 years, right? So I want to know, forget CSR policy, whatever the government has, what are some of the most creative funding ways you can come up with? For example, I was talking to Purvi from Story Weaver, and I'm like, okay, if NGOs are creating data and contributing this data to the open source ecosystem, which startups are building upon, I was like, okay, why can't their future profits be tied into future CSR? So what are some of the most creative ways you've been like, okay, why are we not funding open source ecosystem in these ways? I would love to know if you've had any moonshot ideas like that.
Can I take that? The challenge with open source is that it's great at creating value, but terrible at capturing value. So, if we, so it depends on the philanthropy or the, goodwill of people to contribute back. I think FOSS United has been trying to kind of get that awareness and, get more people to contribute back because, if you're using open source, you're probably saving millions and millions of dollars, especially if you're a large organization. And slowly, I think that kind of change is coming through. But it's also an extremely difficult time for non-profits in India right now. Many non-profits that I've been working with have moved to a for-profit model simply because, getting FCRA, getting, all the... So, unfortunately, I don't have a good answer. I think it really requires, a lot of creativity on the part of the founders of the project to keep it sustainable. And I wish there was a better ecosystem. One solution is also that, there is a lot of suspicion for foreign money coming in. One of the efforts that I've been involved with is to get more Indian organizations to fund some of these efforts which are long-term in nature. this is not like, say, Helpage India or, Child Relief and those kind of things where you give money and you see an immediate impact. Many of these efforts are, where you see a long-term impact over a elongated period of time. So the funder also has to have a long-term vision and, long-term willingness to invest over a period of time. I mean, except for, say, Nandan and a few others like him, we have not seen those kind of philanthropies come up. Maybe things are changing, maybe slowly we'll have more and more funders come up.
So
But
I
we'll
just
take
wanna-
one more quick.
I just want to add, I mean, one of the other things that we've been doing with at Avni is to create services which help fund part of and the gap funding still comes from the funder, but it's still a large gap.
we explode that, but the problem is that if you're running a non-profit, only 20% of your revenues can come from service contracts.
Yeah, so we
If you
have
go above that, you risk losing
Yeah.
your non-profit
So we
status.
have a for-profit
That makes
as
sense.
well.
Yeah,
to help us do that, because ultimately we have to sustain,
yeah.
right?
I mean, there, something like the Red Hat model, you have a Fedora, which is the open source community, and you have Red Hat, which is the, the for-profit entity, and the two support each other. Maybe that kind of a model could work for many of the digital public goods. I don't know if that's a useful answer to you, but we can maybe take it offline. Yes.
Thank you. There are a lot of amazing conversation and a lot of questions are there, but I'll stick to one, especially on the thought process of creating an open source which is acceptable to the level of adoption. And I think you mentioned 80-20 rule, and also mentioned about like starting from one use case and then thinking about like how it can be propagated. So if you can elaborate a little on the thought process that goes from separating a project to a large scale ecosystem where the open source thing that you're creating can actually be used in multiple use cases. So if you can, how do founders who are thinking about open source can think about not just one custom solution, but actually a large scale thing? So some thoughts on that would be very great.
So I think I'll take from some of the solutions that Adi suggested, which is that flexibility in the product to be contextualized for different settings is very, very important, right? And most often customers don't know that. But as open source creators, or if your product is not contextualizable to and easily, cheaply, very quickly, then it's a project. It's not a product or a platform. So that's why Salesforce scales, right? So that is very important from a software point of view to think about and do early on. Because the more you go down a path of building for one, it becomes harder and harder to make it, like generic. Which also means that, we've had customers, or we have had, because Avni is partly we do implementation to support ourselves. But it also means that some customers, they say, hey, it's not completely relevant for us. Yes, you will have to make some of those hard decisions. You want it, exactly the way you want. Do you have the money for it? Can you maintain it? The example she gave, like, this is the path, this is the journey, and this is the journey for custom software, right? But they don't know that. So educating that.
I mean, we've been hearing that for the last 20 years.
Yeah.
ERP users say, oh, this doesn't,
Yeah.
it won't work in my organization.
Yeah.
My problem is different.
Yes, I am unique.
Yeah.
Now, and that is sometimes you're able to articulate it and they understand it. Sometimes they don't, they learn it the hard way and then they come back.
So, I think we are running out of time, but Adi, I'll let you have the last word.
All right. So I just wanted to say, one, if you're a developer, please do a course on software engineering. that will tell you how to build things in a modular way which can be composed together. Yeah. If you're starting something new, also think about not sort of, I'm not saying recruit a product manager or something, but read a book or look at examples of good products. And the way to do a good product is to talk to many, many potential users so that you can get a long list of use cases. Yeah. And then you start abstracting. Computer science software is all about abstracting. You will have 20 different use cases, but suddenly you will find that 2-3 components are what you need to be able to service all of that. And that will give you that razor sharp outlook ki what to build, yeah, how to build, yeah. And also
spoken like a true professor. Thank you so much.
Sorry, I mean, I can't help it, right? I do that 24/7. But also from the entrepreneur hat to answer your question on how to fund an open source, I mean, something, right? With CSR, you don't have 3 years of experience and all of that. Please find an NGO in the room who has that and help them write a grant proposal. Yeah, everyone wants to fund AI. There are many problems because you've got to be true to making sure that your thing actually leads to impact, and it's not like one of those snake oil solutions that people put out and then get money and build something useless which is of no use to anybody. Be true to yourself, but it's a, you know,
you have to package it in the current marketing lingo.
Yeah, you have to market. There's no way out of that, right? You need money, you have to find somebody who can get it for you. Find an NGO and work with them to write a grant proposal, right? Yeah. Somebody who believes in your idea and get moving, yeah?
So thank you everybody for an excellent panel discussion. I think the one common theme that, you know, really stood out among all 3 of you is that, you know, the power of listening, the power of, you know, listening to your communities, the power of listening to the funders, etc. So thanks Adi, thanks Pradipta, thanks Akila. Thank you so much.
Oh yeah, let's do that. I just pass it on.
Thank you.
Thank you to all the panelists. It was a really engaging discussion on what all can be done with open source, and there is so much that can be done. We'll quickly move on to the next set of panels under the Adopting DPG sub-theme. I'm quickly flashing the panels on the screen. They're actually happening across both halls, different tracks. But for this one, we have strategies for getting a DPG adopted. So as we know, adopting is not straightforward, as we just learned in this panel. And there are so many pathways, players and parties that are involved. They come together to create the impact at scale, which they intend. For this panel, I would like to invite Mr. Kiran Anandam Pillai, who will be the moderator. Kiran was advisor with the National Health Authority, supporting NHA to create the 2 major digital public goods, Ayushman Bharat Digital Mission and PMJY. Kiran is a telecom engineer by training and was a founding member of OnMobile, where he led product development and helped build into a public listed company. His other volunteering works including working with UIDAI on Aadhaar, with iSpirit, and several other committees. Currently, he is founder and CEO of Eye Drishti, which is an eye hospital chain that delivers high quality eye care from a district capital to a village level. Welcome, Kiran. Really excited to have you moderating this panel. Over to you.
Yeah, thanks. Hi, everyone. So I think we heard a lot about what it takes to actually build a DPG. So this panel is really about what it takes to get adoption going. So we'll quickly invite our co-panelists. Ravi, please join us. Ravi is basically the Chief Digital Officer of the Digital Bharat Collaborative, which is part of the Piramal Foundation. Can we have Purvi Shah? Is Purvi here? Hi, Purvi is the Chief Operating Officer at Pratham Books. And we have Liliana. Liliana is the Director at the Impact Lab at Dimagi. So we are very fortunate that we have 3 people with us who have actually been quite successful at not just building an open source, but getting it adopted by the community. So I think it'll be great for us to actually learn from them as to, what were their stories that led to their DPGs being adopted. In general, my experience with DPGs has largely been more with slightly different format, which is the DPI format, which is where you kind of get the government to take on and build digital public infrastructure. And that has its own set of challenges. It's just because the government is backing does not mean that adoption is easy even in that segment. So I have been working, for example, with the Ayushman Bharat digital mission. So while we talk about in India, talk about the success of things like UIDAI and identity, which also I worked on, as well as UPI, it has been a much, much harder journey in terms of trying to get other DPGs like the Ayushman Bharat digital mission also in terms of the adoption cycle. So all of these adoptions require many, many factors, including, at least on the government side, it definitely requires, what is the value and the use case to the ecosystem. So very strong definition of that. Many times it requires incentives, it requires, sometimes mandates, at least when it comes to the government side. But when it comes to overall, when we're looking at DPGs, and we can look at each of their stories to understand, what their journeys have been. So Ravi, I think yours is kind of closer to some of the work I do with government, because with Piramal Foundation, you've been doing a lot of work supporting and engaging the government. So tell us a bit about your journey with the DPGs. What are the kind of DPGs that you guys have been building, and what has been the challenges and the approach that you have taken for adoption?
Sure. Hey, thanks. So I'll begin with, I guess, Piramal Foundation journey. But before that, maybe I'll give a little more context, a color. So I come from a for-profit world, and I built a SaaS business and sold it. I'll just give that flavor because you'll see some of that come up from the for-profit. But Piramal historically, again, has been in the space of healthcare, education, among other verticals. And in healthcare, we have a DPG called Amrit, which is fairly mature. It started off with the journey where we build it for our in-house consumption. We had a lot of mobile medical units for which we build it, and we had a helpline for which we started the journey. And then eventually we had a EHR product as well as product for HWCs and PHCs, the health and wellness centers. So right now this with 4 product lines, I guess our journey has been, we started off with our in-house and then we made it an open source. And now we are in the stage where building the community. Our adoption historically has come from, again, a lot of these MMUs and also the government, partnerships and our ability to do pilots and scale up there, right? But I guess one question, or rather one point I want to highlight is, one of the things we realize is for the funding side and for the adoption side, somewhere you need to build the ecosystem, not only of developers, but of, say, system integrators, of private bodies. So in some sense, I am a believer that you need a healthy mix of private as well as non-profit for any DPG to kind of do very well. So I think you need a system integrator who can help you scale up, and there are certain parts much better done in a private sector, and you could, like I think last panel we saw, you could have your own private sector and non-for-profit, or you could have that as a partner. We are only non-profit, but I would think that having a partner who is a for-profit can help in this journey. I'll just pause there with some.
Yeah. So that's definitely true. I think many of the guys who have been successful, when you start seeing that there are more than one player who wants your DPG, the question always becomes, who's going to support me, who's going to implement me. And I do believe that getting that partner would be actually really powerful. Lilian, I'm just going to move to you. Dimagi for me has been my first exposure to a global DPG, I would say, where significant adoption across countries. In the health sector, for me, I first saw it with Dimagi. So really been following your guys' work and really been happy to see how that has panned out. I know it's also been very challenging for Dimagi in terms of, again, adoption, funding, and so on. And I think when I was talking to you, you were sharing that you're recently trying to build a new DPG again with AI, with AI-powered chatbots. So tell us a bit about, what is the reason why you picked this? What's the demand you're seeing for this DPG, and the challenges in getting an adoption for a DPG with AI these days?
Thank you. So for those who don't know, Dimagi does have a long-standing DPG called ComCare. It started being developed back in 2008, did not become a DPG until 2021. So there was a large gap between when we started developing the product and then when it became part of the DPG community. And one thing we're learning from is to start the DPG journey earlier with our next product. DPG is focused on providing technology for frontline workers. So anyone who works at the last mile of any system, it could be healthcare, it could be agriculture, it could be financial services, is a potential end user for us. And our technology is focused on vernacular languages and offline accessibility. With ComCare, we built a business on top of an open source product. So we do offer software as a service subscriptions to ComCare, which has been a way for us to sustain the core product, which was something that came up in the previous panel. So we do have customers who use the technology on our hosted environment, and that's a way that we're able to reinvest in the core product and make improvements available to our open source customers, who include governments using the tool for their national electronic community health information systems. We've grown a lot to start including new products, and in 2022 November, those who follow AI know that ChatGPT launched, and all of our work on scripted or rule-based chatbots became obsolete overnight. And as a technology company, we wanted ways to quickly iterate. And when a new model was coming out, to be able to use that model to integrate it into our existing programs. And we started from day one thinking of anything we built as something that could be reused. This turned into a product that is called Open Chat Studio. It's a tool that you can use to create an AI-powered chatbot or assistant. On one side, you have your large language model from any provider. In the middle, you have our orchestration layer, which is all open source. You can build your prompt. You can use retrieval augmented generation or RAG to access context-specific information. You can enable voice and local languages. And then on the other end of the platform, we have the end user channels. So we have WhatsApp, Instagram, Facebook, Slack, etc. The demand we're seeing for this type of DPG is pretty high because lots of people want to be able to use AI, but the customers that we work with or the end user we work with don't necessarily have technical capacity to spin up their own instance of an AI-powered chatbot and to implement the evaluations that are required to make sure what you've built is safe, accurate, and useful. We've also seen from technologists there's a demand for the product because we help you avoid vendor lock-in. So OpenAI has made it really easy to build and launch a custom GPT. But the catch with using a custom GPT is you have to use OpenAI models. You can't go and use any other model. So we're seeing demand both from people who lack technical capacity to set things up themselves, who want a way to leverage the power of AI, and then from folks who are really deeply embedded in technology but don't want to get into a vendor lock-in situation from the beginning. And so those are the kind of sources of adoption that we've seen so far.
Lovely. So does DPG provide this? Do you have you, like Ravi was saying, have you guys built a system, integrator ecosystem to support all of this demand that you're seeing, or is DPG trying to do it yourself? What's the...
It was DIY for a while. We have like DPG friendlies in the ecosystem. We'd reach out and say, hey, can you try to host this on your own and give us feedback on how it went for you to improve the ease of hosting that solution. We've also offered free pilots of the software to partners who are interested in building on the platform, which for us is a way to get feedback and make sure we're not only building for our own needs, but what the partners are interested in. Now we've received an investment from the Gates Foundation, from their digital public infrastructure team, to create or to make Open Chat Studio a digital public good. And a large part of our funding will be going towards the ecosystem building. So finding local developers across the world where we hope to implement and having them contribute from the beginning.
Lovely. I think that's really nice to hear. Yeah. I think I'd like to move to you, Purvi. I think we have heard two stories of people who are trying to build DPGs in the software space. And I think at Pratham, you guys are an example of, Storyweaver, which is a platform that you have built more with an open content kind of a place. So tell us a bit about, your journey with this open content idea. What are the strategies and what are the challenges, or how did you get it into the adoption space?
Yeah. So we are Pratham Books. We are a children's book publisher. We publish children's storybooks in many, many languages. We're a non-profit. Our mission is to see a book in every child's hand. And as you can imagine, it's a lofty mission in a country like India, which has so many, many languages. And so about, around 2013, 14, we started thinking about what is it that we had to do differently to be able to achieve our mission faster. And it wasn't, one big breakthrough idea that sort of led to the adoption of Storyweaver, but a series of great design choices that rested around open, which the organization had made a philosophical choice around. So we said, so the first sort of pillar really was that we said we'll open license all our content in the most liberal license for anyone to do whatever they wanted, as long as they, contributed and attributed. So that was really one of the sort of game changers, I would say. The second reason why we sort of really scaled very, very fast. So for example, right now Storyweaver has about 65,000 storybooks in 380 languages of the world. And I truly believe that while open was the foundation layer, the reason why we were able to scale so fast is we really distributed the ability to solve. We really did not say that we have all the answers. We know what quality means as publishers. We do know what quality means as publishers. We are an award-winning publisher, but we did not put that burden on our community. And that ability to let the community decide what's best for them sort of really led to the adoption at the scale at which it did. And of course, we were not a tech company. We are a publisher at heart. We are a mission-driven organization. But we did, like I said, series of good design choices, So we also said that what makes a good storybook, right? There are three things. There's text, there is images, illustrations, and there's the design format. So we sort of took these three assets and we also put them on the platform in disaggregated manners for the community to do what they wanted to do. So if I were a teacher and I had a great story to say, but I was not able to illustrate it, I could use my image bank on Storyweaver and create a story. So that really was the second sort of reason why we scaled. The third is really a community-first product mindset. So we really listened to the community, and I think we had very strong boundaries as a publisher that always, the ethics of it always came to the front while making those product decisions. So, for example, when we were working with a partner in Africa, they said, we are a university and internet is not always there and there are students who are translating, how do we make this happen? And we built a whole offline translate capability. When we started working with marginalized communities, we realized they didn't have laptops to translate. How do you get to 380 languages? The goal was not to get to 380 languages. The goal was to say, hey, I'm working with this community in Maithili, and they only have smaller devices to translate. What can we do? So we built a whole mobile translate feature. And so these are some of the design choices that helped. So I think it was a really great combination as I reflect back of 10 years of Storyweaver, where, complete innovation at a hyper-local level. At the same time, great adoption with governments, grassroots organizations that helped us show impact of those books that were being created on the platform, being used in classrooms, being used for language acquisition, being used for language revitalization as well. So I think that's really been our story.
Yeah, fascinating. And I think, the key takeaway has been, really listen to your users, and how do you actually plow that back in so that you can actually improve the adoption and
see and sense all the time. Yeah.
Okay.
Absolutely.
I think very challenging to do. Easy to say. I've always found that it's much harder to actually implement it, and so I think it's really also about building your organization culture to go around that particular piece.
You're absolutely right, and we've done it with a very, very lean team. So one thing that I always feel, so I read every email that comes to the contact ID. I don't know why, but I just read. And I feel like the minute there is, you have 4 or 5 emails that come in like, we are struggling here, that's a very good sense to say that a lot of our community is struggling with this, and this is the idea that you want to bet on, and this is the feature that you want to bet on. So that's been our sort of. Yeah.
Sure. So
But I hear AI can help a lot now.
glad to hear that. So Ravi, just going back to you, I think one of the things that I think you mentioned when we were speaking is also about, and I was also thinking about, so when I look at, I advise governments actually in other parts of the world, and many times we tell them, don't try to build, let's say they're trying to build a registry or they're trying to put together something. We say, there's this big DPG database, and there's a whole bunch of these software available. Why are you starting from scratch? Why don't you just actually pick a DPG and adopt? And one of the questions that keep coming is, we have little to no experience. So apart from the person who built that original software, who else can actually take and easily implement? I think, of course, we see it very often with things like Apache or with other things, but when it starts coming to very specific applications or products, there is always this question about, is it really something that's easy for me to pick up and adopt? And also, where do I go for support? And how much does the question of, is this going to be supported, or is there a community behind it, and is there funding behind it, which is not easy to answer, like if I'm an outsider and I'm looking at it to make a decision. So tell us a bit about, what has been your experience with these challenges that play in the role of adoption of DPG ecosystem itself and the funding part too.
No, I think it's a great question around, how do you kind of convince a state government? So I think there are a couple of parts to it, and I'll maybe try to peel it one by one. One is around having the community adoption itself, where you get, the open source committers to contribute. And again, everything boils down to what is the value exchange that you have with that individual, right? And so for that, and again, by the way, I want to give a shout out to my team who's here. We have a booth as well, so you can go and visit and check out what Amrit does. But what we tell to first to build that adoption, because I think eventually when we have adoption from software developers, it will actually go around the community and more software companies will learn. So this is the bottom up way of adoption. If I can get enough software developers from college or from other companies participate, and when I go and talk to those companies and SMEs to onboard on SI, by the way, this SI program is not yet done. We are trying to think about and build it, then it'll be faster. But what is it that I offer to a young college student? So I think we today have good reach. I think in Assam alone, we had thousands of ASHA workers using our FLW app. We have in Chhattisgarh. So you're looking at, if you make an open source contribution, it will reach masses. It's going to the rural public here. So that's the first thing we offer. The second is, of course, we have amazing set of folks who are both, I guess, MBBS doctors as well as, architects, which is a rare combination, who is guiding you. And that's why, we have had reasonable success in last few years to build that community. So that's one part. The second part is the financial aspect. I think somewhat, coming from a Piramal Foundation, we can always have some of it, but we always are looking for, other donors who can participate, so that the government feels that once they are back, once they are committed to it, that they have, backing it, and then they can, so that there's more trust around, adoption bit, I guess, right? The third is the ecosystem, which I spoke about. If I can have enough critical mass, eventually it's about having critical mass where an SI also gets integrated to train and have people work on it as a platform. If I can go in just like the Red Hat or other models where I have open source DPG, which is core, and then I have other people who are actually offering those services, I think that's what will, get us adoption, if I were to kind of answer some of the parts of your question. But it's not easy, right? It's not easy. With the government, we always have to do pilots and prove it, and then over time they develop the confidence that we are there to kind of handhold and kind of scale it up. Yeah.
Do you see, for example, over time, has there been any sign of governments providing certain funding, at least for sustainability and support?
Yeah, no, that's also a good question. So we usually think of at least the server or the scale cost should be borne by the government. Again, and we all know that and in some cases it is working with, let's say, an NIC or other parts of the government, etc., which may be not so easy, like even with Aadhaar, etc., you guys or whomsoever was involved had quite a bit of a journey. But actually, our model is we'll pilot in a district, and for the scale, and that probably we can bear most of the cost, but for the scale, etc., the government has to bear the cost, because that's only the sustainable way. Because if, as a non-profit, if we are only going to run it, I think it's not get deployed. So to us, that we try to ensure. And in fact, in some cases, after the pilot, government may do an RFP, an RFQ, and we are totally fine. We'll give our product as a DPG open source, anybody who they select as a vendor can then use it and then deploy. So I think that's the scale pathway for us, is what I have seen at least in our journey.
Thanks, Ravi. Just going back to you, Liliana, I think one of the things that I was thinking about was, and you kind of briefly touched upon it in your talk, at least when it comes to chatbots and AI today, right? So there's this lot of this question about ethics, the whole AI ethics side. And also, for me, mentally, there is also this question about liability, right? So if wrong advice provides, I remember reading an article where ChatGPT supposedly drove somebody towards suicide, right? So, and that's, the question of liability kind of comes in. And given that you're also operating in an open source kind of a world, how are you tackling these issues? Because I see these also as strong barriers towards adoption, because unless we can have a strategy around how we address or answer them. Tell us a bit about the current thinking within DPG on these.
I think there has to be a policy framework and ecosystem that allows governments to adopt these tools. Right now, we're seeing adoption by organizations, but not necessarily by governments. I don't know if DPG will be able to solve that problem, but I do think the ecosystem will mature over time. What we are thinking about in the meantime from a product perspective is the evaluation of the chatbots. So we often say among our team that it's very easy to build a party trick chatbot. So you can build something in 5 minutes that looks pretty impressive at first brush. But when you start testing it and asking lots of questions and looking at those responses against your benchmarks or your gold standard responses, you quickly find that there are issues with accuracy, reliability, contextual relevance. And so we are thinking about building the evaluation framework within the product to be able to run those evaluations in a more automated and sustainable way, so that people who adopt the tools have higher confidence that they are going to be reliable. The other thing that we think about is the capacity building for partners to understand the limitations of the models that we are using. So we don't build our own models. We can use custom models. We can use frontier models from the large providers. But those models are based on training data, which may or may not represent your target population who's going to use the chatbot. And so a lot of our work with partners is helping them understand the ethics related to bias and the lack of information that the chatbot is operating with, and making sure people know those limitations before they adopt a particular solution. We also think about training partners on better system prompting. So maybe the underlying LLM training data was not contextualized to your particular use case, but you can provide a lot of context to the LLM so that the response it provides is more appropriate to the end user. And so I think as we're building our community, we will need to work with developers, we'll need to work with managed service providers who can run the software for partners. But then also for the ones who want to give that chatbot to their client or to their frontline worker, to make sure they understand the risk that they're taking on. Of course, the benefit that they're getting, but the risk as well is an important part of our role.
Is there, once you actually deploy something, is there an ongoing process for also looking at what the quality of the responses are, and how is that typically, how do you get that to happen?
Yeah, so we actually use other open source products to put this into our platform. So we have the ability to set up something which is called an LLM as a judge in the industry, or basically using a model to rate the response of another model. And so what you can do is configure another chatbot essentially to review the responses that were provided within our system and flag it if it has any concerns. And so one thing we've invested in for our programs is developing those evaluations and being able to tag the responses on an ongoing basis. The other thing is making sure that you can have a human in the loop. So for our platform, if you are an administrator and have access to the backend, you have access to all of the transcripts of the conversations that are happening. This is another advantage of a platform. If it was OpenAI, you're using a custom GPT, you wouldn't know what was being said to people using your custom GPT. Here you can see all of the sessions. And so we're investing in building tools for human evaluation of the responses. And eventually what you want to do is get your human evaluation of responses and your AI evaluation of responses closer together. So you can rely on that AI evaluation more at scale. But AI evaluations are
Challenging.
evolving a lot. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a
Yeah.
challenging space, evolving space. But good to know that within the open source, there's now a tool that potentially people can consider where you're actually solving some of these basic problems. So great to hear that. So Purvi, coming back to you, I think I loved the way you talked about, your journey with Storyweaver. I'm sure there was also a whole bunch of challenges. It
When
wasn't
is
as
there
easy
not?
as that you showed. So tell us a bit about the challenges you faced in the adoption side. But also, I'm also interested in understanding, many of the people here in the room are from the software side. So what are the learnings from, say, your open content journey that the software DPG world can probably take away towards adoption?
I'll try to draw the parallels. I don't know how relevant or what the takeaways are, but I'll start with the challenges. I think the first challenge that started is when we took this great call that we're going to open license all our content. Very happy, get to work and realize, oh my God, all our creator contracts are copyrighted. So in order to create this large corpus that would go onto Storyweaver as open, we had to actually first go back to our old creators, our entire author, illustrators, and translators. And actually, we did these mini sabhas across 3-4 cities, and we brought in the open community. We got in a copyright lawyer. We got in, our community, and we talked. We talked a lot about why open is good. I think I saw something on today's agenda that said the future is open or something. I think when we launched Storyweaver 10 years back, our launch blog post says the future is now open. So that was quite, it was nice, jog down memory lane. But I think that was one of our first challenges where we actually had to go back and set many processes right so that we future protected the work that we wanted to do. The other challenge that we faced is that if we wanted to be the world's largest library, not because that was the goal, but because we wanted to serve children with the most diverse content in all the languages, it's not something that one publisher can do. So we really, in the early days of Storyweaver, tried talking to many, many publishers to open source content, if not at scale, at least backlist, etc. And it was really a very difficult challenge. I don't think, and for rightfully so, right? Most publishers were not open to open licensing their content because they thought their sales would get hit. Even though as a publisher turned platform, we saw that all the content that we put out on Storyweaver actually sold equally or more, not less, but yet we could not change that dynamic. The other challenge was really of trust and quality, and I think we talked about that, and the previous panel also talked about it. When it is community-driven content, the ones adopting the content are going to suspiciously look at it because, hey, what's the quality of it? As Pratham Books, we have a team of editors and translators and reviewers who work on 1 year to release 25 titles, right? As opposed to the pace at which content gets created with community. So as a platform, then what are those strategies that you deploy to have verified content, to have your quality checks in place? So that's one thing. And I think there is a parallel there between open code, open content, and then trust within the contributions that come through open content. Attribution is one thing that we really paid a lot of attention to, because we were very, very, very clear that if we are building this, or we are hoping to build this large community 10 years back, that's going to voluntarily contribute to the platform and to our mission, we need to ensure that their time and effort is accounted for. And so everything on the platform, if you contribute, comes, there's a backend tagging, attribution layer, etc. So you cannot mess with that. And but we also fail there because we are CCBY 4.0. We have over the last 10 years found that a lot of other individuals, for-profit publishers, textbook publishers have taken our content, sometimes attributed us correctly and our creators correctly, which is great, but many times not as well. And when we find those cases, we do try our best to have them recalled, but that's not always the case. And I can see how some of that can happen within the coding community as well.
Happens all the time.
So I think that's something for both sides to see what can be done. And I think the third challenge, oh my God, yes, this one we really failed in, I think. So there were no standards to integrate into various platforms. So when we worked with the government, there was something that was required. When we worked with an app, there was something that was required. When we worked with a tablet, there were hajar ways that we needed to integrate. And we were like, I think so mission-centric that if we saw that, yes, our content could go there and create impact, we was like, yes, we must invest time, effort, money to, and we did that. We invested the time, effort, money to do it. More than half, no, I think 90% of the time we never got the impact back. I think Venki talked about that in the previous panel, right? We are very bad at documenting our impact story. I think we are a case study in that. So we just did not get impact data back. And we've created a white label, we've created multi-homing. Matlab, you say it and we've done it, But it's not sustainable. And we did not do the smart thing that, you talked about, Liliana, or I think Pradipta talked about in the previous panel, is creating microservices out of it. And it's not we didn't have the idea, we really wanted to, but several things, small teams, lean teams, no team to run behind a market to gain out of the market microservices, right? And 3, what again Venki talked about is the 20% rule. Not many organizations can donate to you, and if they do donate and we hit the 20%, we lose our non-profit status. So all of these sort of challenges led us to say, okay, let's just focus on our mission and not worry about. But the sustainability bit becomes a tougher challenge every year based on these decisions that we've taken over the years. I just want to take 30 seconds to talk about one thing that was on our agenda last few years that we tried out and was very successful. Is building product is very tough for a non-profit, and we have a small product team that maintains and sustains Storyweaver. But we did our first sort of partnership with C4GT and tried out a small module on tagging and algorithms and AI, and I think that was very successful. And we feel that maybe as a strategy, that's one of the things that we could do, is carve out these projects. But like Pradipta said, that I truly believe what Pradipta said. I've been saying this, was so good to hear her say that there has to be a core team that holds the vision of the product. If everything is left to community and open source, it may go anywhere. So
I mean, I think if you look at almost all successful large open source projects, there is always a core team. There is always funding for that core team. I think it's a very important thing that people miss, that without that, and there is somebody in the core team who is really passionate about building the community. These 3 factors usually always come into play. I think with that, I'd like to open this panel up for anybody has any questions in the room for any other people.
Well, thank you. I mean, great point shared by everybody. I have a slightly opposite kind of a question where apart from funding and community supporting a DPG, why would you think a DPG would fail? And what are those check marks we should keep in mind while even thinking of building a DPG? That this is something we build, and we have seen, and in last panel also it spoke about it. There is a graveyard of software and DPGs that are being created and not being adopted or being used. So what are the things that anyone who is building a DPG should keep in mind, that it should succeed, and what are the guardrails they should set in the first phase itself to start with that?
I can take a quick stab if you want. So I think we didn't cover this, but I should begin with that. A product always begins with something that it solves for a person. If you're building something which doesn't solve a pain point, that's the number one reason why it may fail. And the chances of this may be higher on this side, and I'll be a little more self-critical, because you got 3 parties, and I had this in the internal discussion. There's a donor, and there's an end user, and there you, right? In a for-profit or in a marketplace model, you get the feedback. If you don't build correctly, you die. But such is not the case. So you probably have a higher chance of a disconnect between 3-party system where you're actually not solving somebody's problem. If you don't solve somebody's problem, it's not good. That's my thing. I mean, and I think I heard the contrary, and I'll still say it. People said, I want to build for 5 use cases. For me, from the lean startup model, it's actually another one which we don't believe in. I think you build for one sharp use case, which is a dominant use case, and do it very well, then only adoption comes. These are my 2 points I want to share.
I would add that we had a discussion at Damagi internally before this panel to say, okay, what did we learn from having a DPG ComCare that we will use for our next DPG Open Chat Studio? And something our CEO said was that with ComCare, we tried to be everything for everyone. And so your point on a single use case really resonates, that as your software and your code base gets larger and larger and larger, having a community that can really understand all of that code base and modify it becomes more difficult. So that was the first thing. And I think the second thing is we've seen how important integration or interoperability are. So I think if you're building your tool, maybe it solves a problem at a moment in time, but you can't take that solution and plug it in with all of the other work that you're doing, that it would be something people would pretty quickly decide not to use.
Anybody else? Any questions for them? Can we?
Hello, thank you. It was great listening to all of you. I'm Radhika from Rocket Learning. So Ravi, you touched upon adoption by state governments. So I was wondering what would be your response to what Liliana said about there not being enough policy frameworks in the ecosystem to support the government to adopt a solution like this. I think the government is always looking for pro bono partnership from NGOs or solution providers in general, and they face a lot of systemic challenges in being able to embed or adopt a technology solution. So I was wondering if you had more thought around policy framework environments and how can we collectively maybe do something about it.
Yeah, no, I think it's a hard question. What I'll say is where some of the gaps, and I was in another discussion around AI related, especially AI in health tech. So there are standards for say devices and there are standards for drugs, but there isn't a standard for use of AI in health tech technology. And this is, by the way, a institution started by Government of India, Trust, the AI COE, and they are still saying, how will I launch it? Because that's so to some extent, there are these bodies who are trying to now work with the right organization to create the policy. I'm more concerned around the AI bit is what I would say, right? But in general, I guess the point, I mean, there is no easy answer. I think most of the times we have used is a piloting approach and see if the government wants to do an RFP, RFQ. That's what so far. But there are definitely policy gaps. I'll just pause there. If you have any more thoughts.
No, I think if you're really, there have been lots of successful use cases of scaled up solutions coming from the the DPG sector with the government. I mean, in health, almost all of the big solutions, whether it's the the NCD program, whether it is the NICSHI program, all of that have been donor funded. May not have been built fully as open source or DPGs, but now moving in that direction. I see Setu here, who's done Argosoft, and they have done this with frontline workers in many states. I think it's very important that the organization that's taking up this engagement with the government, come with the clarity that for at least the first 3 to 4 years, they will have to find the funding from outside, but set the tone in the negotiation that this is not forever. I think the most important thing is the expectation management and the MOUs that you set with the government, where you do talk about a transition plan. I think it's important not to not have that conversation. I see sometimes that those conversations are never had and they come later. And so if you do enter into those, at least in my experience, I have been anti this idea. I mean, I'm being very frank. When I started working at the NHA, I insisted that the government pay for everything. So if you look at the negative of that has been nothing is in open source. Okay. We have been adopters of open source, but at least all of the DPIs that so far the National Health Authorities have built are being paid for, run, managed and operated by the government. So that's okay. And so that there is some amount of budget and sustainability that they'll put in because they committed upfront to that problem. But I do know that many government departments do struggle with coming with that money upfront. NHA was lucky that, it could get a budget from the central government to build these DPIs. It doesn't really happen that easily. But I do believe that it's about how the organization that's dealing with it manages that relationship and sets the expectation.
Thank you. Liliana and Puri, if you also want to add maybe about how can we collectively work on this, I think would help.
You might have a better answer than me. I'm really not sure. I mean, with ComCare, I think it's been easier than with the AI tools that we're deploying now. The point about handover and transition resonates strongly. For ComCare, we've tried to build a local providers network that's able to do local hosting because we know many governments need to host data in their own countries. And so one important service for us to be able to provide is to equip local stakeholders to host their own data and manage their own system. But in terms of like how to support that policy framework and the development of that ecosystem, I'm definitely not the expert.
I do, I mean, it's just a little technical point, but one of the things that I advise people coming in with a free software to the government is 3 things, right? So usually in about 2 to 3 years of a DPG's life or a solution's life in the government, you see stability. You know, the feature request starts to kind of go down. The first year is terrible. So, you know, but after that it usually starts to go down. So what I usually say is make sure that hosting is always the responsibility of the government from day one. So at least one cost and one piece is taken away. Second, I argue that from day one, have a small team from the government that's responsible for installation, configuration, and patches. So, you know, there is somebody from their side who's at least involved in that. And so that over time, they can at least transition some of those. So, you know, they may not be able to make feature changes and requests, but at least if they can maintain, configure, and operate, you still see a lot of benefit in sustaining it over time.
Yeah, hi. This is Sulabh from ISDM. And I've been working with government in various states. What I have realized that creating a DPG has its own challenges, but the adoption is far bigger challenge. I just want to understand from your experience on how you have managed that thing, because at the leadership level, still there is that willingness because they have certain deliverables to answer. But at the lower level, DE level, it becomes very, very difficult and complex. So I don't know, want to understand from your experience, what are some of those?
I think you hit on a lot of the key points, right? Sustainability is a key thing for us. We want to have enough skin in the game from the government and be not shy about that. I think those are some of the important things. But from a bottoms up, I guess this is where a lot of our field work, field visit, understanding the community, like the work, for example, we are doing with the CHOs is still happening. How do I actually really solve the problem? Because he or she doesn't have time for data entry. Because unless I get the grassroots adoption, it is going to be another department order that has gone down, and we don't want that, right? So I think we are in that sense listening to them and seeing if there could be innovative, like maybe voice to text, so they don't have to type and see. I think the other thing we are also seeing is what is a big, if I may use the word, killer use case. So what we found in the FLW app was like the payments were getting delayed by 75 days. So we felt if we can integrate payment into that, and that's the model we are doing in some states, and get the payment to say 15, 30 days, all of a sudden that becomes a killer use case, and now you get adoption. So for each of them, we have to think just like I would do for a regular product or something, but that's at the center while we are managing other constraints around government sustainability. That's my 2 cents. Yeah.
So I can connect both the questions at this point because they're similar. So we've had 2 different and interesting use cases. One happened during the pandemic in Maharashtra, where because we were that time digital public good wasn't a thing, but because we were open and freely available, UNICEF came to us and we already had a reading program which we sort of deployed via WhatsApp. It was a learning for us, it was a learning for them and the government as well, but quickly we pivoted and made some frameworks, make some modules. So in year 2, because of the, we reached 2.5 million just in Maharashtra in a 22-week period during the pandemic through that program. And because the government saw the impact of that, they came back to us in year 2 and said, can you train us to do it? But no money. But that's okay. We had already built most of the things. So we did that. We did the trainings, etc. And year 3, they adopted the entire program. So we had branded it as Goshtisha Shanivar, which is a Saturday of stories. Every Saturday, one story gets delivered via WhatsApp. They called it Nipun Goshtisha Shanivar. And until date, they're sort of deploying it successfully, and similarly we've seen it in one of the Urdu programs that we did. We just did a training with the academic authority, and through the training they sort of saw you know, how teachers started translating, then they started using the books, they had digital infrastructure, and it was so amazing. I mean, that community was just so amazing, where the teachers actually onboarded every child onto the reading program that they had created on Storyweaver. Okay? And we had some gamification of certificates, which honestly I never thought would see the light of the day from an adoption perspective. But these teachers, and you know, if a child has read 50 books, they would get a certain type of certificate. 30 books. These teachers, government school teachers, have printed the certificates and given to every child. So.
Great. I think that's all the time we have for the panel folks, but all of them will be available outside. So if you guys want to interact further, but thank you everyone.
All of you, I think would have the chance to go through the community showcase booths. A lot of interesting products being showcased this time. So hope if you didn't have the chance, would request if you can go after all the sessions are over. So yeah, we'll move on to our third sub-theme, which is sustaining DPGs. And the next panel will focus on models for funding tech for impact. Now, DPGs and tech for good products have always operated in a resource-constrained environment. Then this discussion will help unpack how to carry forward the funding conversation that is so critical to sustaining all these DPGs and tech for good products. Our moderator for this panel is Kriti Mittal, who is currently the Associate Director at eGov Foundation, where she leads policy and strategic initiatives to advance eGov's population scale products. In her previous role as entrepreneur in residence at Omidyar Network India, she led efforts to build safe and inclusive digital ecosystems, working closely with government, multilaterals, industry, and so on. She has her experience in urban governance, livelihoods, micro enterprise, women empowerment, and so on, and has a unique perspective on everything in the intersection of governance and impact. So welcome, Kriti. We are excited for you to be moderating this panel. Over to you. Yes, please.
Hello? Okay. Thanks, Parth. All right. Hello, good afternoon, everybody. Hopefully you'll be joined by a few more people as and when they wrap up lunch and come. It's first of all great for me to be back at DPG Dialogues. I think I've observed the Code for GovTech journey over the past 4 years, and it's been really good to see it grow and now to transition into a long-term sustainable community. I think, I'm really excited for this panel that we have coming up on models for funding tech for impact. And I'll start with sort of introducing each of the panelists and inviting you, up here onto the stage. So first of all, we have Manisha Sabu joining us from Infosys Foundation, where Manisha is the head of the foundation. And she leads a number of initiatives across education, healthcare, rural development, and digital inclusion, including support for technology-led social impact programs. And she brings extensive experience from her prior leadership roles at Infosys as well, driving delivery, industry partnerships, and large-scale digital transformation efforts. Next, let me call up on stage Saurav Das, who's part of the investments team at Co-Develop, where he works on supporting population-scale, public interest digital infrastructure through technology and technology adoption and research. And his background spans evidence generation, policy support, and governance, including his time at ID Insight and as a LAMP fellow. Then we have Harish Doraiswamy as a director at Central Square Foundation. Harish supports state governments on school governance reforms, EdTech, and competency-based assessments. And he has also previously led Pearson's K-12 and international qualifications portfolios in South Asia. And finally, we have Himani Baid, who leads fundraising and partnerships at Rocket Learning, one of India's largest early childhood-focused social enterprises, impacting 4 million low-income children. Oh, you've updated me, it's 5 million now. And she works closely with governments and donors to scale tech-enabled community engagement and early learning programs. So welcome, to all the panelists. And for all of you here, I know this is the dreaded post-lunch siesta slot. So if you find yourself feeling a little bit snoozy, do get some coffee. I hope there's coffee outside. So feel free to go and grab some coffee and come back. I think, just to sort of set some context for us, right? This topic is actually pretty close to my own work. As Parth mentioned, leading the DPGs portfolio at Omidyar Network, and now at eGov Foundation as well, where we work closely with a number of different country governments to build and help them adopt DPI. But I think one thing that I've observed, over the last few years of looking at tech for impact solutions operating at a population scale in particular, is that, funding is not just an enabler of tech for impact. Sometimes it's actually an architect of the journey that tech for impact solutions have over several years, right? And that's really what I want to, surface in our conversation today, because I think each of you has experienced different models of funding, either from a grant-giving perspective or from a practitioner perspective. So, what have your learnings been in terms of what are the kinds of funding models that help sustain a good solution over a longer period of time and, take it to large-scale impact? Because I think it's not just about sort of funding the code, it's also about funding the capabilities, right? So that's really going to be the sort of objective of the panel. And so that we have a kind of a common frame of reference, right, as we go through the discussion, let me just, outline three broad sort of funding models that we commonly see, right? And if you feel it's not comprehensive enough, please feel free to add other models. One is, of course, state-led financing, where the government takes full responsibility of the recurrent costs, right? An example that comes to my mind is like the National Urban Digital Mission, where, philanthropic partners and organizations like eGov essentially sort of help the government build the initial model and prototypes, but now it's fully state-owned and state-funded and state-staffed. Then you have community or market-led financing, right? Which, Manisha, you would be familiar with, as well as you at Rocket Learning. And here the Hak Darshak model comes to mind, right? Where you sort of blend CSR, government contracts, as well as user-side monetization. And I believe also they've raised venture capital or equity funding. So it's a blend of all of these different approaches. And then you have sort of philanthropy and grant-led or CSR-led, right? Where you have a shared governance structure as well. So something like MOSIP comes to mind, which is the modular open source ID platform, where you have philanthropic funds that help build the core, but then government funding takes over in the different countries where it's being adopted and sustained, and extensions being built in various ways. So if we just take these sort of as the prototypes, right, as a starting point, and with that, let me sort of frame the opening question to each of you and have you come in with your opening remarks in response to this. And then we can come back with another round of questions, right? So we've seen and we've talked about these various funding models, especially this philanthropic capital converging around DPI and now AI for impact as well. So from each of your vantage points, what types of funding models do you feel have helped sustain and scale adoption beyond the initial development and pilot stage, right? And if you could each, share a few specific examples, that would be great to sort of bring it to life beyond just the theoretical concepts. So why don't I just go in this sequence and start with you, Himani? And if you could share with us a little bit more about, either Rocket Learning's own journey, but also your insights from, being in this ecosystem.
Thanks, Kriti. I work for Rocket Learning. We are a tech not-for-profit. We work on early childhood education. We work very closely with both state and central governments, partnerships to improve the quality of early learning that is done in Anganwadi centers. So we work very closely with Anganwadi workers and parents. And to answer this question, I'll take a twofold approach, where one is that what I aspire, what I think is a model that needs to be there for scale and sustainable adoption, but also some of the early things I'm seeing at Rocket Learning and the model that we are seeing that's happening in the last few years. So what I think when I think about a model that is more sustainable, I'm looking at something that's not very sequential, that you have philanthropy for innovation or initial grants to have a proof of concept and then government comes and adopt it. But can it be a more cycle where you have initially philanthropy coming for flexible innovation funding, then after you have proof of concept, then you have government, but then also philanthropy coming at various angles at the third level, where it's more about assessing, where it's more about quality assurance, where it's about more innovations when we are talking about tech for impact or AI. And why am I saying it? And I do want to give examples, and what we are seeing at Rocket Learning is in our early stages, we got a lot of philanthropic support. There was a lot of flexible funding that we got, and we were able to build our platforms. To give you context, while our front end is very simple, where we send content on WhatsApp, there is a very sophisticated back end that tracks all data, that ensures that all data goes to all the Anganwadi workers and parents that we work in the 12 different states that we are working in. So a lot of flexible funding really helped us build that proof of concept, and then we had our RCT that showed that 6 months of Rocket Learning program is actually improving the learning outcomes for children, and also we are seeing that Anganwadi workers are spending more time in the centers. So once we had that proof of concept, now what we are seeing and what we are having conversations with government, they are in two ways. One is when we are entering new states, we are going to them and telling them that while in year 1, philanthropy will support the program, but in year 2 and year 3, can you take up some of the cost for implementing the program? To give you context, if our cost is $1.5 per child, 70 cents of it, comes from government, it comes from district, and 80 cents is still from philanthropy. And when I talk about that 70 cents, what I mean is, can you pay directly our tech vendors? Can you pay for cloud costs? Can you pay for district coordinators? So this is a model that we are seeing, which is with our new states. Can we have these conversations? And we are seeing some interest and some states saying yes. With our existing states going with a fresh MOU and be like, we have been here for 3 years, we have proof of concept. Can you now start paying at least in 1 district or 2 districts some parts of the product? Another model that we are seeing, and that's working still in early stages, is a technical support group model, where we go as an expertise, where we provide them with a content playbook of how we run the program, but they implement the program in their district. So that is another model that we have in one district in Jharkhand, and it's still something that but where philanthropic money, to give context as to why I'm saying that it needs to be in cycles and not in sequence, is that I still feel, and we still think, that we'll still need philanthropic support for assessments, quality assurance, ensuring whether this model works or not before government completely adopting it. So this is the kind of model I think that I'm thinking of when I think about scaling and adoption at large scale, because for Anganwadi workers, we have 14 lakh Anganwadi workers in this country. Doer at large and payer at large has to be government. So it needs to be government funding, but still some philanthropic.
I think great point that, with philanthropic or CSR funding, you can't just come in at the beginning and then once government adoption starts, decide that your role is over, right? But I think what I'm hearing from you, Himani, is that even at those later stages, there are a few things that can't be state funded, and you need cyclical support from the grant funders. Over to you, Manisha, from your experience, with leading impact investments at Infosys Foundation. What do you think have been, some examples of success or success stories in terms of tech for impact solutions that have had a long-term adoption pathway?
The Infosys Foundation is a CSR organization. So we give grants, or we ourselves sometimes are tech experts, because we're a technology company. We will develop and we will say, okay, this salary is paid from the CSR grant. But ultimately, it's about developing for usage. So the model which works for us is, we develop, we will maintain, and we will reach out to various people for adoption, especially government, because that is when it is scale. So the adoption is done. So this is what works for us, because we are a technology company, and I'm involved in CSR for that. So, however, which projects we take up for this model is something that we very carefully design. We align them with our themes and the work that we want to do. For example, we want to be in eye care, so our project is Site Connect, which is there. Or in the education, we have Springboard. And before this, during Corona time, we had helped Karnataka government. That is a slightly different model. But right now, the model which we adopt is that we will develop, we will manage, and people please use it free of cost, because there's licensing, there's data, and all of that is there.
Go ahead, Saurav. Same opening question.
Yeah, thanks, Kriti. So I'm from Co-Develop. We are a funder in digital public infrastructure, and we are mainly in the tech adoption part of it. We fund DPGs, and we work very closely with eGov and other DPGs that provide fundamental foundational capabilities to governments. I would say we see this from two perspectives. One is like when it comes to what kind of models work. There's the demand side of it, where it's like governments who are actually implementing projects, and then there's the supply side of it, which is creating the tech that governments can use. And I think in both of these cases, I think the main question that drives all of this, of which model works, is what is the problem we are trying to solve for. Like in some cases, are we solving for market failure, or are we solving for like something like vendor lock-in? And I think each of that determines like, what kind of tech you need to develop and who needs to be engaged, and reducing it to like obviously it's a very broad space, but reducing it to like what the kind of actors that are involved is philanthropies. One, there's governments, and I'm equating also governments and together with the MDBs, which are like a lot of digital transformation projects are actually financed by loan operations from world banks and other multilateral development banks. And then the third is the private sector, which I think has also a very important role to play. One model, for instance, just to give you an example that we have seen that has worked, it's like starting to work, because for anything to scale, you need governments to kind of finance it at some point, at least when it's something like a foundational capability. So we, for instance, work with the multilateral development banks because they have a power to shape the market. And a lot of it lies in like, the reason a lot of governments are not able to, let's say, adopt open source is like procurement laws just generally don't allow it. Like there is no framework for procuring open source tech within the multilateral development banks. And we worked with one of the regional multilateral development banks where we tried a new model of saying, we provide some kind of grant money, and we specify that, you procure a very specific kind of social good tech. Now that's one model. I'm not saying that's the only model. Another model that we have seen, for instance, is we have funded a lot of core foundational capabilities which solve for a very particular thing. Like you mentioned MOSIP. MOSIP solves for identity, authentication. There's OpenG2P which solves for like G2P transfers. But the private sector and like the problems that governments are trying to solve for are not limited to like one sector. And the main thing about infrastructure thinking is you need to have the capability to solve for multiple things without rebuilding things from scratch. And that's where the private sector actually has a very good role to play, because you have the foundational capabilities. They're able to take this tech and actually build things that governments can use to solve other things. And they can procure it, they can work with the private sector. And I think engaging with in a way that maintain some principles of what governments care about while also providing value is going to be important. And philanthropy definitely has both an important role to play, both in the supply side and demand, where one, obviously creating this tech, but like you mentioned, today it's AI, DPI, right? 5 years down the line, philanthropy will have something else to care about, right? So I don't think that is a reliable model for long-term sustainability. Of course, some part of it will always be there. So I think with that comes like, what is like models where we can allow these projects, this tech to like scale and sustain without being dependent on philanthropy. Funders should create incentive for that. And I think there's different models to do that as well. And obviously it's not just about creating tech and doing a pilot, and risk capital is what philanthropy is like, usually used for. But like Himani mentioned, it needs to be involved in also technical capacitating, like allowing governments to be able to work with this tech and not just allowing them to adopt a tech and then going away. So I think there's different models there.
Hi, my name is Harish. I work in Central Square Foundation in EdTech. Slightly different from DPI and DPG, but there are lessons that could be learned from EdTech that might be relevant for DPI, DPGs. Because the government has been the biggest funder of EdTech in the country since 2008. However, all the money, or most of it, goes for hardware, right? Hardware is necessary for EdTech, but not sufficient, because unless there is quality software sitting on it, children are not going to learn. And the government has been, it is fair to say, slower or to recognize the potential of software than it has been on recognizing the power of hardware. Now, also, because the question was around how do you generate adoption that is sustainable. I think we need to take that one step further. How do you get it to have impact that is sustainable so that the adoption becomes a no-brainer, right? So I think that's the thing that is missing. And the edtech space hasn't helped itself because it hasn't invested too much on evidence creation, which makes the case compelling for the governments to actually keep adopting it. One of the models where I think at CSF we've seen a few models play out that are, I would say, a blend of some of these models. We saw a model in UP run by Niti Aayog for something called personalized adaptive learning, which is one of the few edtech modalities which has solid evidence behind it. A lot of edtech doesn't have much evidence behind it. They are, brought to this world by tech guys and not ed guys. So there's too much tech in edtech and not too much ed. And many of these products fail. But personalized adaptive learning happens to be one of those products with a lot of evidence. However, we know that what works in a small scale in, say, private schools may not work well in a large scale in rural government schools. So what Niti Aayog did was it worked with 4 aspirational districts in UP and created a outcome funding model and gave the contract to an edtech vendor who within 3 years had to demonstrate that children learned substantially better using their software than a control group that didn't. So here, the incentives were all lined up. The government paid a portion of the money only if the learning outcomes were delivered. So to that extent, the government could hold the vendor accountable. The vendor stretched the extra mile and put the kind of support systems that required, that made the program successful, because even with good edtech, what makes a difference is the program behind it. The implementation behind it is solid enough. EdTech is not plug and play, just like DPG may not be plug and play. But for, say, identity, there is going to be a permanent use case, right? But in EdTech, what works, the quality of vendors, the quality of support, all shifts. So I think to align the incentives of the players, the government, outcome-based funding is something that has been experimented with and has been proven to work.
Thanks. Let me stay with you, Harish, because I think we've dived into this, edtech world. So let me stay with you, and then I'll come to you, Himani. It's really interesting that you described, outcome-based funding, right? And with a specific solution that has evidence, the impact becomes measurable enough for you to do something like that. But I think across impact tech, one of the sort of common constraints is something much more banal, right? Administrative changes, lack of institutional capabilities. So in CSF's work with, state governments as well as central governments, have you seen, funding models that help overcome those kind of constraints as well? Institutional constraints, administrative changes, what makes a solution last longer? Because it's not always as simple as this works for the kids and it's improving learning outcomes, so let's fund it. Because you have to then convince the new administration about that as well. So, what are some of those softer things that you've observed, and how can funding models be thought of in a way that helps overcome that?
So CSF is about 300 to 350 people. And almost all of the work that we do is in program management, right? And we get funded, right? So for us to get funded, or for organizations, a lot of Rocket does a lot of work in building a product. But then once the product is built, most of the money is raised for program management. Now, whatever we can put on the ground, the government can put 1,000 times the number of people and the resources that they can, except that the institutional framework is not there for them to prioritize this for the next 5 years, right? The next shiny object comes, and the next scheme comes, the next yojana comes, and then everybody is distracted, right? So ultimately, for all of this, the fundamental product or the problem that we are trying to solve needs to be so important to the government, and the way that we are solving it needs to be so unique that it sustains government interest. But beyond that, there needs to, for instance, there are a lot of good non-profits and a lot of good edtech vendors who work with governments with CSR money. As long as the CSR money lasts, they run the program. But the government is not involved in running the program, right? So the day that CSR tap shuts, the program dies a natural death. So how does one, things like government notifications, chitti nikal di, these are all mundane things but make a difference, right? Do they have they appointed a nodal officer or not? What are the powers of the nodal officer? Does the nodal officer have a convening authority when he calls for a meeting with 10 district officers? Do they attend, right? So the thing is that institutionalization requires a series of announcements and a series of very small steps. All institutionalization will fail if the secretary does not do a single review, right? So all of this really matters. The critical thing is, can we get small things to work? So at CSF, what we have is we have a one-page institutionalization framework. It has 10 elements to it. We go to every state where we work and systematically try and implement each one of those 10 elements, right? So it's very simple. Everybody does it in different ways. But when you get CSR money to actually run the program, then I feel that it kind of militates against involving the government to run it, right? So as Himani said, there are two different ways of doing it, right? You take philanthropic money, run a program, deliver impact with 1 lakh children, but delivering that same impact through the government machinery for 1 lakh is a completely different problem and involves a completely different set of institutional solutions. So I think it's not the money, because the government doesn't need more people. It needs very strategic support on data analysis, on convening meetings, on just governance of a program. And then somebody from the government needs to be there with the authority to be able to actually convene meetings, drive the program, report results. There is something called the Vidya Samiksha Kendra, which is a nodal center for collecting education data. Now, if the EdTech program data is not coming on the Vidya Samiksha Kendra dashboards, it's not going to get reviewed. If it's not going to get reviewed, there is no way of institutionalization. Right, so
yeah, I think really important points, and we've seen that in eGov's work with governments as well. If you don't sort of build co-ownership with the government stakeholders from the beginning, then it's likely to be much more of a transactional thing, right? As long as your funding lasts, do the program. But if you don't have government champions right from the beginning, you're unlikely to transition into sort of a long-term sustainable model, right? Himani, coming to you, just from Rocket Learning's experience. You now operate at a sort of national scale, right, with millions of families who come to the Anganwadi centers. What does it take, also building on what Harish said, what does it take to sort of financially and operationally keep this kind of high impact platform running? And what is something that funders, or your funders in particular, have underestimated in the past, without naming names, but what is something you wish that funders sort of understood better, right?
I was not going to touch on the relationships with the government, but since we are continuing, I'll touch on it. And some of the unglamorous bits that I feel funders have estimated, I'll come to onto that later. But like Harish said, I think, and like you said, I think it's very important to also then build relationships at all levels of the government, because at Rocket Learning, we are such a ops-heavy organization. We work closely with Anganwadi workers, supervisors, district collectors, and then at state, we have PMUs, and then central level. So you have to build those relationships at all levels. Even within central government, you have to build relationships with a joint secretary, with a secretary. They will change how to ensure that ECE or importance of early childhood education still remains important. So having those champions, I think, has really something we have paid a lot of attention on and worked, and having different team members at every level build that relationship. Also, what has worked to make sure that we do trainings for Anganwadi workers. Now, Anganwadi workers anyways have so much work to do. They are resource constrained. How do you make sure they come to 3 trainings in a year? So you really need to get your supervisors involved, ensure that they are the ones who are there telling their Anganwadi workers to come see value in these trainings, and make it easy for them ki you do your monthly meetings there. We give them dashboards, cheat sheets to be like, this is how this Anganwadi worker is performing. Maybe you can encourage them or tell them that maybe they can do it something differently. So having those relationships and building these at every level has really helped us keep the operational bit at state level or district level going. But I think this is something we are able to communicate to funders, I feel the unglamorous bit of the tech program. And if you are a tech program and you're a not-for-profit, and basically you're sending content to Anganwadi workers and parents, having a customer servicing is so important. Like, we have a team of these callers who talk to these Anganwadi workers and parents daily and solve their queries. Now, having this strong set of people who are actually talking to them for smooth delivery. Now, these are some things you don't tell funder. No one funds this. No one knows about this. Second thing is how complicated this backend platform we are talking about. We are talking about sending content to 12 states in 4 different languages to parents and Anganwadi workers. Then we are creating content which is contextualized. We are creating videos in Punjabi where an Anganwadi worker wears a pink suit versus Rajasthan where it's a sari, and now we are talking to Andhra Pradesh where like change the color of the sari, which means creating more videos. And how do you use AI but also keep human in the loop? Now, I feel these are some unglamorous bits that funders really underestimate or don't know a lot about. And we are not just sending content on WhatsApp. There is a lot that goes at the back end. This back end platform is really at the core, but you have very less people funding that. So 2 things we've been able to find some solutions is like really talk to your funders about this. Tell them, show them how we create content, show them how this backend works. But also we've been able to get some funding. You have flexible funding, or you have funding. Vedis, for example, is an organization that is funding our backend platform, so we can make it a platform that can work as a platform as a service. So really having these funders know about this and get them to support is, I think, some of the ways we have been able to work at ops level, and flexibility in funding has really helped us. One thing we've been able to actually also work is we have flexible unrestricted funding which goes into this, but your CSR funding really helps in supporting programs, but you have grants from foundations that helps fund this.
Thank you. I think, Manisha, it would be a great point for you to come in here from sort of the funder's perspective. Are these kind of, the kind of things that your grantees have discussed with you? From a CSR funder's perspective, what are the sort of challenges you faced when you look at, large-scale tech? Or then, switching tracks a little bit and coming back to our DPG ecosystem. What would it take for a CSR fund to be able to support DPGs, which are, much more long-term and large-scale rather than sort of project-based impact fund, right?
I'm so glad that you're asking me about challenges, because I have a list. So I'll at least tell you 3 different challenges that I face. The first one is at the creation stage itself, because I mentioned that we create ourselves. And so while we are creating, we know that there are other organizations, other NGOs, or some of our vendor partners also, who have some module or something which is little more mature and we can actually adopt it. But that is because I know only one or two. And I wonder, I know this because of my relationship, but what about in this whole India or world, there may be something which are phenomenally great, which I could have utilized in my platform building. I'm not aware of it. So I always am very jittery that am I unnecessarily recreating something which already exists? There's no directory, there's nowhere, no body of knowledge is there where I can look up and say, in education tech, this is what is existing, available and ready to share for the employment or job related things. So it's not there. So it makes me less confident. Am I unnecessarily rebuilding? Am I duplicating unnecessarily? So that's the one part. Then the second comes into adoption part of it. That's the main thing, right? What are you building for? Somebody needs to use it. Now there may be some people who have told us we are working with, and they'll say, okay, these are the requirements. We talk to them, we do design thinking, we understand and we build the product. But ultimately at the population level adoption, which like my board says that don't take up any DPI or DPG creation unless at least 1 million people will use it. Now 1 million people using it, how many adoptions have to happen? So it's not even my area, right? I'm not tuned to adoption. I'm tuned to creating. So that becomes a challenge. Like, how can I be sure that I'll be able to say one day to my board that yes, I did have this kind of adoption. So adoption is a big place. Actually, I didn't want to be in this panel because the other panel is about adoption. And I wanted to listen to panel and learn. These are the challenges that we face. So adoption. So of course we are doing pretty well. Our Springboard platform is has 6 million registered users, which is pretty significant. So if the 6 million users on a platform is big. So that is about the adoption. And the third layer is of course continuation. Because for me it is a project. CSR has to be a project. It can't be operations. So I'm not responsible to run, or I should not be responsible to run the DPG forever. That's not my job. CSR money as per CSR law is for 4 years. You can make it 8 years, you can make it 12 years, but it's not perpetual. So somebody has to take over from me and say, okay, now onwards we will manage this. Could be data privacy or security or whatever, maintenance. And like she said that she has a team which supports. So all of these things have to happen. And somebody has to run with it and there's nobody there. So sometimes I feel that I should not touch on this DPI, DPG kind of work. Because it's quite deep and there are lots of challenges, especially from the CSR perspective.
Thank you. Really interesting points, Manisha. I think especially, what you said about not wanting to duplicate something that's already happened. I think that's really where the promise of DPGs also comes in. And maybe Saurav, you could comment on this as well. Because rather than needing sort of a directory of solutions that exists, you're now trying to support a common building block, So everybody then reuses that same common building block. And perhaps that's one way to sort of solve the duplication problem that funders often face. You have multiple organizations coming to you with a similar sounding pitch, right? Saurav, if you could come in here and, I'll also throw at you a sort of out of syllabus question, building on what Harish was saying and what Himani was saying. At what point should a philanthropic fund step back, right? Suppose you build government ownership from the beginning. At what point do you say that we no longer have grant funding and therefore we have to transition to complete, state stewardship or some kind of market or community owned model?
Thanks, Kriti. first answering the earlier question, I think even today, earlier in the first session, I think Sujit was the one who again mentioned this duplication issue. And I think that's something we are also kind of tackling with. I mean, forget like a global scenario. If you go to Bangalore today and do a census of all the DPGs, just one component, let's say registries, you'll find it in probably like 10 DPGs. Doing different things, but ultimately like probably 80% of it will be similar. I think one of the questions that we have been also thinking about is like, what is it that needs to be rebuilt? What is it that can be like reutilized? And I think the idea of reuse has been something that we are starting to stress upon. Not to say that co-develop, when we initially started funding, the idea was to like first prove that this tech works, which is where adoption was like the main kind of KPI, I would like to say, that governments need to see that this works on ground, for which reason people built like different tech. But now we are at a stage where like you don't necessarily need to build that same things over and over again. I think like, you can use the same thing and tackle different problems through using that tech. And the second point that I would like to say is this project-based financing, right? I don't think it's just a philanthropy problem. It's just generally like how governments, MDBs approach digitization, digital transformation. Nobody is funding products. Nobody is funding like, operations, OPEX. Like, all World Bank funding comes with the idea of funding CAPEX, which means that the loan is going to health ministry to build, hire an SI to build like one vertical solution without the agriculture ministry knowing that, what this tech is. And I think one of the reasons we are kind of advocating for the infrastructure approach to digitization is exactly this. Like, you need to coordinate across, you need to create incentives for people to not rebuild the same things again and again. Now coming to your second question. So one is like, we said when the World Banks and the IADBs and ADBs are like, giving loans, a lot of times the way they structure these loans and the procurement frameworks, it's like the question is, who do you fund? And the idea is like, always have to fund a program. You have to give it to a particular ministry, and you cannot fund like, something that a government can like, install and like ask someone to just maintain over 5 years. Instead of that, they will have to get into a contract with a vendor. They get logged into the workflows of that vendor for, let's say, the next 7 years. And then they don't know what to do with it. And the second problem is narrative. Like, for instance, Kriti, eGov does, let's say, 3 main things: urban sanitation, property tax collection. But Digit, as a platform, can do 10 other things. How many people know that? Like, for instance, in this particular room, like you, Harish, Rocket Learning, they're working on EdTech. I would say like a lot of the tech that exists can also be repurposed to work for education. But the DPGs don't have the capacity to be doing everything. Like right now, one of the problems on the DPG side is also they're the ones doing the sales, they're the ones doing the evangelizations, they're the ones doing the first L1 level support, they're the ones also hiring an SI to do implementation. This is not the DPG's role. The DPG's role is to like, create actually the tech and work with like markets and their partner ecosystem to make sure governments have the capacity to like, implement this. And I feel like a lot of that funding incentive should go towards making sure DPGs actually are focusing on the things that they're the best at, which is like, creating the tech, creating the community, rather than focusing on going and selling it to the government. So it'll never scale in that sense. Lastly, coming to the point that, sir, can you repeat the question that you asked about education?
When should philanthropy step back?
Okay. I don't think it's a question of stepping back. I think it's about, from the very beginning, the question should be like, what is your role in this and what is like the path to scale? Like today, we as co-develop, we see ourselves as a catalytic funder because we are a smaller fund. We don't have like millions and billions of dollars to give out. So one thing we have started to do is, when we are going, let's say, funding an implementation, first question is, what is the use case? Because a lot of times we have seen that because of hype, governments will be like, I want to create a wallet. For what? Like, what reason? Are you actually solving something? That's the first thing where, from the very beginning, be clear.
Or now I think the new version of that is, I want to create an AI augmented version of this.
Bot. Yeah, like why? Like, is it solving any real problem? And second is, what's the path to scale? Like, are you setting aside money for this in the long term in a budget? Do you have like an institution that will be responsible for this? Do you have the capacity? If not, we'll fund capacity building, we'll fund capabilities. But do you have it to do it? Or do you have a local vendor ecosystem? India is like very good in that sense. Like, we have 10 firms that can actually work with the government to like, solve a lot of problems. A lot of smaller countries don't have that. And I think, and the second thing is, if like there's a World Bank loan, then we work with like the MDBs to say that, see, we'll do the risk capital, we will prove it out on ground with a pilot. But the scaling has to be like something that you have to think about from the very beginning. We don't necessarily see ourselves as saying, oh, we are done here, but it's like our job is to make sure like prove something on ground, or to make sure that, you know, when there is scale financing available, kind of hedge all the risks in the beginning, and so that the scale financing can actually scale the implementation.
Great, thank you so much. Parth is signaling to me that we have to move downstairs for the next panel, really. Or the next panel has started in the other hall already, so we have to wrap this up really quick. Really sorry, I think, you know, I've been told we don't have time for audience questions on this one, but I think everybody is around to answer your questions afterwards if need be. Let me just quickly sum up. I think we've covered a lot of different themes, and this is definitely not a solved problem and will not be a solved problem anytime soon. But I think we've talked about sort of the need for a cycle of funding rather than linear funding. We've talked about co-ownership by government stakeholders and building that in from the beginning. We've talked about various challenges of duplication, of adoption, of continuation. We've talked about CapEx versus OpEx funding. And I think many of these conversations will sort of continue to be ongoing. And, you know, I wish we had a government person on this panel as well, because I think that's sort of the missing perspective here, right? We have practitioners, we have funders, and one government person on the panel would have really sort of completed the loop here. But thank you all for all your insights, and thanks to everybody for being here and staying awake in the post-lunch panel. Over to you, back to you, Parth.